been thinking about plans and the difference between ability and planning. To give an example, the United States government has taken out individuals, reportedly, we assume, we're told, narratives, which can provide stories, whether or not you take them as 100% unembellished or whatever. Like the raid on Osama bin Laden, the killing of Muammar Gaddafi, killing of Saddam Hussein. Specifically, like these small covert ops style situations where maybe you have 10 SEALs or 10 special forces and they parachute out of a helicopter. And there's many stories like this, spy, James Bond style stories that are inspired by real events, because sometimes you need a special ops guy. It's not just the Americans who have done this, but a lot of countries have invested in their special ops. 1 agent, 2 agents, 10 agents, just a small number of people can infiltrate a situation, take out a key point, and gain a lot of progress from that in a conflict. So, you could say that's the basic argument for minoritarianism, that a small number of people can have a really big effect. That if you're starting with the ground up, if you're just trying to convert people ad hoc, if you're just trying to spread the word without any plan, then we've got a problem, right? But on the other hand, if all you're doing is planning, but at no point do you invest in creating the kind of qualities that would allow you to enact plans, then you also have a problem, right? You have a problem if you sit around thinking about policy papers and, the type of people who like to rewrite the Constitution. I'm going to write a new Constitution for my own particular ideology. And I think it's very useful to look at the left and listen to the left, because they're saying the same exact things as the right. Now, of course, the content is different, the substance is different, the policies are different, the ideologies are different. But if you forget about all that for a moment and you realize that, okay, well, someday down the line that could potentially have an impact this way or that way. But for the moment, all of these ideologies are basically equal because they're not really being enacted in the way that these ideologues want them to be enacted. To some extent, I think they're being used, right? They're being implemented selectively. We have Donald Trump as president, which supposedly you'd say is a victory for the right wing, but then we have all these left-wing things happening. And so the actual, how should we say, the enacting of events, of political change happens, I don't think according just to what the ideologues are planning, but it really has more to do with, I think, media influence, control of bureaucracies. We're looking at different kinds of bureaucracies now are under fire, under focus, various international bureaucracies. Who owns these bureaucracies? Who voted for these bureaucracies, right? If this is supposed to be the democratic American-led order, but who elected these bureaucracies? So how did they come to power? If not by election, it had to be by some kind of minority influence, right? By definition, if the people didn't vote for it, then by definition, it has to be minoritarian. Really, the only true majoritarian system would be a system of voting. Even then, we could get into a critique of democracy and expose the contradictions and hypocrisies even within a quote-unquote direct democracy system by analyzing how ideologies are formed in the first place, right? So ultimately, it's kind of this question of, you can invest in an ideology and say this ideology is really great, but if you never tie your ideology to real action and you never bridge the gap, and I would say this is a gap of body and spirit, where the body and spirit become separated, right? And the question is, would you rather have a body without a spirit or a spirit without a body? If you have a spirit without a body, then you can theorize, and I'm using spirit in an animal sense. I'm not using the word soul here, right? I'm not talking about, your individuality or your eternity or higher principles. When I say spirit, really I should use the term mentality or psychicalism or psyche would be the Greek term, to put it a little simpler. So the psyche, would you rather be a being of pure psyche, pure abstraction, pure mentalism, what can be referred to as spirit or Geist, not to be confused with soul, making that differential there. Even referring to Gebser and sort of going through, you have maybe the magical consciousness, or you even have a pre-conscious state, which is maybe an animal consciousness or an animal pre-consciousness, and then you have the magical consciousness, the mythic consciousness, the mental consciousness, and then eventually the integral consciousness structure, which you could say is maybe the spirit and the soul is that integrated structure. But prior to that, we have this mental structure. So would you rather be a purely mental structure or a purely physical structure, a pure bodily structure? Well, a bodily structure can work. A bodily structure can do things, right? Animals can actually do quite a lot. They can reproduce. They can engage in conflict. They can avoid death, right? So there's a lot of things that animals can do to survive. A pure abstraction, pure ideology, pure planning on its own without ever bridging the gap into the body is sort of sterile. It doesn't have any vitality to it. It doesn't have life. And to the extent that it actually becomes a distraction from people being able to get into the body, which I'm using as a metaphor for coming into action, right? So it's almost as if we are these disembodied spirits and we're floating around and we're unable to actually get into our bodies. We're almost viewing ourselves from the third person view. We're having this out-of-body experience where our minds are sort of floating around unattached to any particularity, and we're kind of experimenting with ideology. But what happens is that ideology and planning becomes a kind of a spider's web that surrounds our bodies and prevents us from actually getting into our bodies. Because, for example, we'll say things like, well, I can't engage in the democratic voting process because the democratic voting process is a choice between two moderates, and I have this really complicated extreme ideology that just so happens to justify me never actually getting involved with the political process. Now, we can, of course, point out the limitations of the political process, but that's one example. Could give many other examples. If all you do is you sit around all day and you watch sports, you watch men play football, and you obsess over fantasy football, fantasy teams, betting over football, buying the t-shirts, buying the jerseys, buying the tickets for the games. There's so much abstraction and voyeurism in this third-person, out-of-body experience associated with football. And if you wrap yourself up in that, you can become sick and diseased and obese and quite unhealthy, despite your idolization of this very physical event. So there's this contradiction there, or hypocrisy or oxymoron, where you're idolizing the bodies of these football players, and yet you're never actually yourself as an individual entering into your own body. You're never actually enacting those ideas, those thoughts into your own body. You're always kind of creating this web of, you're not spending your time exercising or dieting. You're spending your time watching football, talking about football, obsessing over football. So it's not just politics. And also we can talk about sexuality, right? So if someone is extremely preoccupied with a virtual sexuality, we would think that, well, virtual sexuality surely will lead to real sexuality. Or we could talk about video games. Surely violent video games will lead to real violence. This is always the projection, that it is always the case that our mentality, our thoughts, our abstractions, our plans always lead to some kind of event. They always lead to some kind of action. They always lead to some change in the body. Now, there is such a thing as bridging the gap between the mind and the body, or the spirit and the body, or the psyche and the body. That happens. In fact, it happens for most of history in a very predictable fashion. And the relationship between the mind and body has changed over time, as Gebser has tracked, right? We've changed through these stages of consciousness structures from these magical, mythical, mental consciousness structures. We've evolved over time. But throughout that process, we can generally say that if someone has an idea that it stands, well, I don't know if it stands to reason, but we just sort of expect that if someone says, I think I should go to the post office today, that person is probably going to go to the post office. Now, a number of obstacles could come up. They could become distracted, right? There could be some kind of intervening, intermediary, happenstance that prevents them from going to the post office. But most of the time we have an idea, and then we have bodily action. And if there's no intervening separation or obstacle between those two things, then naturally the idea always leads to bodily action in the absence of any kind of distraction. It's only when distractions come in, right? Only when obstacles come in, that now the mind is blocked from getting into the body. And so the idea of like psychoanalysis and therapy and psychology in general is to kind of remove all these blockers, so that all the ideas you have of who you are and who you should be and how you should act can actually just be smoothly transitioning, evolving, and flow. We can get a smooth flow. It's like, there's some kind of pipe, and there's guck in the pipe, and we want to remove that guck so that the water can flow freely from the idea space into the bodily action space. That's the model I think most people are working with. But I think there is a counterintuitive point. There's a threshold where we reach, like a critical pressure threshold, where there's such a buildup of ideas and planning and ideology that actually there's way too much, and it creates its own kind of obstacle. It creates its own kind of guck. I might compare this to if you have a funnel or something. Let's say you have a funnel, and you're funneling some kind of mixture material, some kind of sludge. Maybe it is honey. Maybe it is sugar mixed with water in a solution. Maybe it's sugar or salt mixed with water or something. Maybe it's molasses. Maybe it's mud. Maybe it's concrete. Just think of some kind of thick mixture going into a funnel. So we have all these ideas, all these various ideologies, all these different plans, and we're pouring them as we enter into this thinking process. We're sort of pouring them into this funnel. Now, if you focus on your ideas, then you have an idea, you think, oh, okay, I'm going to write a song today. And the moment you have that idea, you start actually putting that idea into action. So you start writing down some notes. Maybe you start experimenting on the keyboard. Maybe you start doing some recordings. And so you're in the process of writing the song. So with every new idea you have, you do something with it. You test it, you enact it, you listen to it, you play it back to yourself, you consider it, you write it down. And so as you're thinking, your thinking is complemented by actions. Every time you have a thought, there is a corresponding action that follows in a kind of sequential logical order that's very purposeful, very directional. And so basically this would be like if you have cement or some kind of mixed, basically dust with water is what cement is. So you've got some mixture and you're pouring it drop, drop, drop into your funnel. Every time you have an idea, drop into the funnel, goes into the action queue. Bam, bam, bam. And so the flow is smooth because these drops are small enough that they can fit through that funnel, and they're going to get into the realm of reality and action, and actually getting out of your idea space and getting into the world and actually changing the world in some substantial way. The problem is if you're thinking too many thoughts and too much abstraction and too much planning, and you do not have a process flow of ideas to action, and so you're kind of just stuck in a quarantine, you're stuck in a prison, you're stuck in this Sisyphean task of generating an idea, generating a different idea. You're never testing your ideas, you're never enacting your ideas. there's no process by which you go from ideas to action. And so your ideas are just sort of spinning in your head over and over again, like laundry in the washing machine, and it never actually gets through that funnel because there's so much of it that it gucks up the whole funnel, and it solidifies and it calcifies, and it becomes, the ideas themselves become an obstacle to action. So we're sort of seeing the limitations of pure planning, and we're seeing that if you just have pure action, right, if you just do things, well, maybe those things are bad, right? And maybe there's a healthy balance of planning and action. But if all you have is planning, ooh, that was an interesting crack. I just cracked myself. Sorry about that bodily interruption. This is supposed to be a purely mentalistic process. So just pretend my body doesn't exist. Imagine it's just the wall, and the wall is talking to you, right? Or I'm just a series of words. Don't even listen to the video. Turn on the annotations. Just read the annotations. And then don't even read it in English, like transform it into like logical syntax. Like simplify my words to the most, forget all the metaphors. Just simplify everything to like syllogisms that you can read in 30 seconds and completely process. But, so we're talking about planning, we're talking about the body, we're talking about, if you just have pure action, if you act in an animalistic way, there's a problem with that too, because we've entered into this realm where, because of agriculture, because of urbanism, because of language, right? Language, when people say things like, okay, you use a lot of metaphors, we just want pure truth, or, God is somehow false, or religion is a lie. It's a useful lie, but it's still a lie, or you're just weak, you need religion and God because you're weak. Okay, so the truth, I guess, that these people want who say these sort of things would be something like, well, it's true that logic is the masculine force that constrains things in the universe, and maybe there's different applications. You could say that in some way maybe logic is connected to physics, and physics is connected to chemistry, all the way down to sociology or something like that. And so we could say that maybe physics is pretty universal, but maybe when you have like black holes, the laws of physics kind of get messed up, and like you can't use Newtonian physics. Now you have to get into Einsteinian relativity, and most of the time Newtonian physics work quite all right, but in these special cases there are certain exceptions. So we can say like, well, maybe logic is the most absolute rule, and then kind of you get to a set of rules called physics, where they're mostly absolute with a few exceptions. And then as you drill down like into quantum particles, then it's like all of the Newtonian rules just have to get thrown out the window. So there's a context in which we can use Newtonian rules as a heuristic dealing with the macroscopic world, but then we kind of have to throw that out the window and use a completely different set of laws. But in truth, it's really one set of physical laws, quantum laws, that really do act a certain way on the micro level, but then when you look at it macroscopically, they're acting by those same quantum laws, but it's just interacting in a probabilistic way, and those probabilities sort of cancel each other out, and it approximates in sort of a, if we're doing our calculus, we sort of say as x goes to infinity, x being the quantity of particles and the scale of the particles, these quantum particles, as x goes to infinity in terms of the quantity, the y-axis would then be approximation or accuracy of Newtonian physics, right? So as we increase the number of quantum particles, the accuracy of the model of Newtonian physics increases, whereas we get on a small scale, Newtonian physics breaks down. So is Newtonian physics therefore a lie? You could say that. I don't think that's really what most people mean by lies and deceptions. When we say Newtonian physics is a lie or Newtonian physics is a falsehood. I think we can say that Newtonian physics is a model, and Newtonian physics models the universe in a way that is accurate in some contexts, but then if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, there are obviously problems with Newtonian physics, and obviously we can criticize and deconstruct Newtonian physics. And so when we talk about the ultimate forces of the universe, logic as the masculine, decisive, constraining force, and then energy as this creative, Chthonian, feminine force, and that this dyad of the universe is somehow behind it. Somehow there's this monad, somehow there's this God. But would that God be anthropomorphizable? Would we be able to say that that God has a human face and a human body? I don't think that argument is very reasonable, but if we are to talk about God in a human context, it's almost as if we're going from the quantum version of God, which is like this very abstract, like, not even beyond, basically beyond logic, right? Because it would be the predecessor to logic in some way, or somehow the union of the masculine logic with the feminine energy, somehow the union of those two, that would have to be what we would have to describe God as, because we can't really derive this reality from logic alone. We also can't derive it from energy alone. And I would say that ultimately the logic does precede the energy, because we can't speak of a thing existing if we don't have laws of logic in order to tell us whether it exists or does not exist, via like law of identity, right? So I would say there is a precedence of logic over energy, but I still don't see a mechanism by which logic would create energy necessarily. If logic does exist, then I suppose energy has to exist, because it's a constraining principle. So it's a very mysterious question of, well, clearly we can't have energy. We can't speak of anything if we don't have logic with which to speak of it, to realize it, to understand it, to perceive it. It basically doesn't exist if there's no right. If we can't say there's a difference between A and not A, then existence is impossible. Possibility is impossible. Everything breaks down. It's only once we have that basic separation that we can begin to even talk about the existence of anything. And so, it sort of means that you would need logic before you could have this energy. But people have brought up that maybe this whole argument is based on the principle of causality, that logic somehow causes energy. But causality is a subcategory of logic itself. So we're kind of in a loop here, or we're using circular reasoning, because we're saying that, before you can have energy, you have to have logic. But that implies causality is something which is necessary, that everything needs a cause, and things needing causes is a consequence of logic. Like, that's a logical statement. Everything needs a cause, right? So if we're speaking about some kind of abstract universe before logic exists, or before energy exists, then why is causality necessary in this situation, this kind of vacuum? So it all gets very confusing at that point. And to think that somehow the union of logic and energy, or the resolution of this conflict, which I haven't really figured out, but somehow think that the solution to all of this is like a man with a face and arms and legs, that is what the union of these two things, or that's what the resolution looks like. Obviously, like, there's problems with that, but it depends on what's the context in which we're using this term God. Are we using the term God to describe, and I think it is a right way to use the term God, right? If we're describing that which is somehow above, or at the root, or somehow the summation, or the originary thing behind everything else, then it's appropriate to speak of God really not in an anthropological way. But if we're speaking of God not as some kind of abstract, like grand unifying theory of the universe, essentially, like, what is the universe? What is reality? in its most basic element, like what can we reduce everything to, that would have to be God. But when we talk about God in everyday life, we use these three words, or I use these three words to describe God as being eternal, infinite, and perfect. And I think that is, and maybe it's a question of semantics. I think Christianity does something interesting, which is that it recognizes that we use God in multiple different ways. We use the term God to refer to kind of the summation of reality, or the origin of reality, or the truth of reality, like what's behind all this fuzz and information. Like, we understand that data has a source. So like if we have a die, a die with 6 sides, we understand that we can roll this die and get numbers, and we can plot those numbers on a graph, and we can see the graph go up and down between 1 and 6, and we could just keep doing this infinitely, and we can keep generating data. We know that the data ultimately comes from the die, that by the random, spinning of the die, rolling of the die, we get all these different numbers. And so ultimately, the information that a die can create is infinitely complex. There's no limit to the complexity of a series of die rolls, but ultimately we understand that we can simplify all of this complexity, or at least, if not simplify it, we can at least trace back its origins to this. Okay, I'm looking at a graph and I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 6, 2, 3, 4, 6, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 6, 6, 4, 6, 5, throw a 5 in there. I'm seeing all this complexity. Where did this all come from? Oh, okay, someone was rolling a die and then they were plotting the numbers on a graph. Okay, now I understand what the simple thing was behind all of this chaos, all this confusion, all this entropy, was actually this 6-sided die, which is a lot simpler. Now I understand the origin of things. Now I understand the source of all this complexity. And there's a lot of mathematical models that we can use to demonstrate this idea of what we mean by God, that which is, right, so the ephemeral data of the day-to-day randomness and entropy of life, that's like the numbers on the graph. And then God is like the ultimate die. He is the ultimate source of everything, and therefore being older than all things, above time even, therefore being infinite and eternal, because he's everywhere at all times, and perfect because he's the simplest possible thing. So I think that's a legitimate way to use the term God, and maybe it's a problem of our semantics, but we also use the term God of like, okay, well, what if I was perfect as a human being? And the Hindus have this term Dharma, which is basically saying that, we're born into this world not as birds, and so we can't just get up and fly away. I mean, we could go in an airplane, but we don't have wings to fly, and we don't have gills to breathe underwater, and so we have certain limitations. Animals have certain limitations, but we're all born into bodies with limitations, and so we can't simply just be God. I mean, unless you're a yogi and you meditate and like you achieve some, I don't know, unification with nirvana or something like that. But essentially, for most people, it's like, okay, I understand that I was born with limitations. I understand that even if I wasn't born with a whole lot of limitations, maybe I was born in a pretty good situation, but maybe let's say I made some mistakes. Let's say I developed bad habits. Let's say I put myself in a bad situation. Basically, every day you're born into a situation, right? You're plopped down into, okay, I fell asleep last night, now I'm waking up, and here are all the good things. I made it I prepared a nice breakfast for myself, or I bought the ingredients for a nice breakfast, and so now I'm going to enjoy my nice breakfast. Or I've made a series of bad decisions, and now I'm waking up on the sidewalk. And so whatever happened in the past, we can't change that. We have to deal with what we're being dealt with today, and sometimes we're partially responsible for the cards that we hold in our hand, and sometimes it's really not our fault. Sometimes it's just been imposed on us, and there's really nothing we can do about what we've been dealt. The question is, what can we do with it? And so we're dealing with all this noise, right? We're dealing with all this feedback of, oh man, I've got all these good things, I've got all these opportunities, but I don't know which one to choose because I've got limited time and there's opportunity cost. I don't know what to do. And also there's all this bad stuff going on. I don't know how to deal with that. Should I ignore it? Should I try to change it? If I try to change it, is that going to end up wasting my time and I should have just ignored it? If I ignored it, will it get worse? All right, so there's this whole field of questioning. And then the question of God comes in of like, it's the question of perfection. How do I move toward the most perfect version of myself? And also you encounter this question of impossibility, of how can we move from one state to another state? How can a person improve themselves? If we define a person as good or bad, then there's no way that a good person could become not a good person, right? I mean, you could do things externally to force somebody to act a certain bad way. That wouldn't change their inner goodness, right? Like if a person, try to give an example here of something like if a person enjoys, I don't know, I was going to say chocolate ice cream and then suggest, we could somehow associate chocolate ice cream with something miserable and so they'd stop liking it. So you can have some kind of external force. But what I'm trying to say is that our model of individuality and personhood implies that a person can't internally change themselves in the deepest sense, that there is some kind of, in the same way we talk about God as the source of the universe, or the soul of the universe, in fact. And we talk about a human having an idea, like a person is weak, but then they have an idea of, I want to become strong. And so then they start training and they become stronger and then they see change. And the question is, did they really change or did they merely unfurl and unfold? Like a seed, does a seed really change from a seed into a sprout, into a sapling, into a tree? Is that really a changing process? Or is the seed really just expressing its innermost nature over time? And if we just speed up time, we can see that basically the seed and the tree are just parts of an organic system of cycling, right? Seed becomes tree, tree makes seed, seed, so on, so forth. So when we look at individuals and we see them, quote unquote, changing over time, the question is, are they really changing or are they just unfolding? Are they just, on some time scale, are they simply just being themselves, right? That is an interesting question. So if we take that perspective of basically people can only do what is in their nature, then someone who is good can only really do good things, and someone who's bad can only really do bad things. And this question of like free will and the ability of people to change their destiny, to change their course, to change their innermost desires. Like there's an interesting idea of like, can a narcissist change themselves? Can a sociopath change themselves? If someone doesn't feel empathetic toward other people, can they learn to be an empathetic person? And there's a lot of, I know who's going to get mad at me for this one. But there's a lot of information out there that says people who are sociopathic or narcissistic can't change themselves. Now, let's just accept that as true or whatever. I'm not really interested in that so much as the general case of, so what you're saying is that some people cannot fundamentally change. Now, if you do suggest that people can change, then there's a kind of arbitrariness to it, right? Of like, okay, well, you say that people can be anything they want to be. Well, then why are some people in really bad situations and other people are in really good situations? If we can just be whoever we want to be, then effectively you're putting the responsibility entirely on the individual. And you're saying that if someone's homeless, they want to be homeless. If someone's rich, they want to be rich. You are whoever you want to be. That again is sort of, there are notions of karma that suggest that we, in reincarnation, we choose the situation we want to be born into. If we feel guilty about something we've done wrong, then we choose to be put in really bad situations. And that is how, children end up in really bad situations, is in a past life they chose to be born into that situation. Alternatively, someone just feels really good about the things that they did. They say, it's time to reward myself. I'm going to be born into a good situation. So there are, these karmic theories, reincarnation theories. But, on an individual scale, like when we're living this life, maybe we can look forward to the next life. But when we're living this life, how do we go from point A to point B? How do we change ourselves? How do we conceive of ourselves in a way that is effective? Because if we say something like, well, I can be whoever I want to be, you say that to yourself and you say, oh, great, I guess I can be rich now, or I guess I can have total self-control now, or I guess I can be an Olympic athlete now. And then a few hours pass and nothing has really changed. It's like, well, did I not believe hard enough? Or is that just a bunch of self-help, feel-good nonsense? And is it actually the case that, people with severe diseases can't just, think a thought and then all of a sudden their disease goes away? So, the question of how much of this reality is a product of your mindset, that's almost a solipsistic view. If you just absolutely say, yeah, everything that happens, everything that goes on is completely something that you want to happen. Then you kind of just affirm everything, right? If something bad happens, well, I wanted it to happen. If something good happens, well, I also wanted that to happen. So I mean, maybe that is the way to go. But I think for a lot of people, that seems very contradictory, because I think most of us, when bad things happen, or when we make mistakes, or when we do things we wish we wouldn't do, like procrastinate, we engage in bad habits, we engage in addictive behavior, we engage in sinful behavior, slothful behavior. When we do these sort of things, then at least if you ask somebody, did you want to do that? They'd be like, no, I didn't want to, but I didn't have the willpower, or something like that. So it's this question again, it's the question of connecting the psyche to the body, to actually taking our ideals, taking what we want to do, and somehow changing ourselves. And there's this inner narrative that it's kind of impossible to do that. When we have problems, we identify with our problems. When we have a problem like laziness, we say, I am a lazy person. If you define yourself as a lazy person, and you ask, how could a lazy person change? Well, they can't. You could give them a book on how to change, but they'd be too lazy to read it. So, almost semantically, when we define ourselves as lazy, we become unable to change our laziness. Same for any bad quality, really. You say, oh, well, this is an immoral person, or this is a person who doesn't care. This is an apathetic person. And so you can take all these bad qualities, change them into definitions, and then create a mental trap, right? A projection, almost an ideology, where you can never change. And anytime you try to change and you fail, or you slip up, or you make a mistake, or you try and you don't succeed the first time, or you try a couple times and you fail the third time and you're back to square one. And so then you kind of go into this defensive mode where you say, rather than do the difficult thing, which is dust yourself off and keep trying, try something different, try again, and just keep going for it. You say, well, this is hard and this is painful, so I think I'm just going to embrace a narrative that defines me as a bad person, a limited person, someone who can't solve this problem, because it's too risky, and I'd rather just keep coasting along and living in my little prison. And you can do that for the rest of your life. Or this is where religion and God comes in, that you can say, okay, well, I've defined myself in this way, rather than try to deny the reality, which is obviously like, yeah, we do have flaws, we are imperfect, our body doesn't live up to our mind, our action doesn't live up to our thought. There's this disconnection. How do we bridge that disconnection? The Trinity does contain this Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and so the way I conceive of the Holy Spirit is this connecting point between the mundane and the divine. That the divine sort of sends out this radio signal, or however you want to conceptualize it, and we can be receptive to that. We can allow that to, we can receive it, and it doesn't require any kind of active decision making on our part, because we've defined ourselves as bad, and so we're incapable of action. But we are capable of passivity. We are capable of just allowing it to come into us, because that doesn't take energy. It doesn't take effort to do that. So we allow it to come into us, and then it sort of infects us. It takes over us. It inspires us. And it actually, God enters into us, and he starts working as this second person, as this different person who is acting through us. And so we can just kind of give up, and we don't have to do anything, and God comes in. So we become possessed. And this isn't an idea that starts with Christianity. The idea of possession, I think, is a very old shamanic concept. Going back to really the earliest forms of human spirituality and religion. The idea of possession, where it's just kind of been consolidated and brought up to the first millennia, or whatever we call this, the post-agricultural, post-urban age. The model's been simplified and everything like that. But that's the concept, that there's some kind of separation between the mind and the body, between the thought and the action. You got to bridge that gap. How do you do it? You have to have some kind of crazy idea. You have to believe that there's some person who's going to help you. Now, nobody can help you a lot of the times, because most people can only help themselves, right? You can give somebody money, but if they're going to spend it on gambling or drugs or prostitution or whatever, then you could give them infinite money. And this is why a lot of lottery winners have bad life outcomes, right? It's counterintuitive, but if you take someone who's not equipped to deal with free stuff and give them a bunch of free stuff, they're actually going to be worse off after you give them that free stuff than if you didn't give them anything. So again, that's one of these contradictory ideas, that actually if you deprive a person, you can create better life outcomes for them if you deprive them in the right way, if you challenge them in the right way, to the right degree. In the same way, if you take a plant and you shelter that plant all its life, and then you put it out into the wilderness, it's going to die because it's not equipped to deal with those challenges. If you take a dog or cat, you shelter the cat and make it fat, and then you put it out in the wilderness, it'll die. But if you over challenge these things, if you take the plant and you don't water it and you don't give it any sunlight, it'll also die. If you take the cat and you don't feed it, it'll also die. So you kind of give it the right amount of exercise and training and traction and friction and resistance training, and then it will be equipped to deal with challenges, and it'll be better able to support itself and pursue its interests. So with a lot of people, it's very difficult to just come into their lives and give them stuff, because when we're dealing with morality, we're dealing with the actions that we take in our mentality, and it's very hard for someone to come in externally and change that without having total control. And so in order to change, if we are to allow someone to come into our lives, change our lives, we really need to submit to them and be receptive to them. If someone comes in, a personal trainer says, okay, we're going to do 30 push-ups. If you say, nah, I don't feel like it today, well, there's no way that personal trainer can force you to do those push-ups. He can't, even if he's really strong and he can kind of shove you onto the ground, and then he's standing over you, he's straddling. Okay, maybe we gotta take out the gendered pronouns. The personal trainer, I don't think the term straddling is good either. I'm just imagining someone kind of grabbing you under the armpits and pulling you up and then pushing you down, pulling you up and pushing you down. And in that way you can mimic the form of a push-up. And if the personal trainer was an invisible ghost, I guess it would look like you're doing a push-up. But in all actuality, you wouldn't be doing the force to push yourself up, and thus you wouldn't be doing the resistance training to get bigger muscles. Same is true for intellectual work. If you hire someone to do your homework, you're not going to become smarter and equipped to actually be able to perform the kind of task that your homework is supposed to prepare you for. Same thing with spirituality and morality. If you live in a prison where you're forced to always be good, the moment that the prison is taken away, you're going to act really bad. So all these things require training: the physical, the mental, the spiritual, or moral. They all require training in order to become good at them. If you want to become a good person, you can't just read a book or follow advice or watch a video. You actually have to do something. And no one can do anything for you except maybe God, right? Because with God, you can think of perfect receptivity. Not just, okay, I have a personal trainer, they make suggestions, they tell me what to do, they yell at me, whatever. Carrots and sticks. But God is so powerful that he doesn't have to deal with any of those problems. He doesn't have to deal with your stubbornness. He doesn't have to deal with your self-hatred. He doesn't have to deal with your self-pity and all your excuses. You can just allow him in, and then he just busts right through the door, and he's the best because he's infinite and perfect and eternal and all these things. He's going to have the solution for you. And so you can say, oh, that's a lie, that's a deception, that's not real, that's not true. You can say whatever you want about that. In the same way, I guess by that same token, you would have to say Newtonian physics is a lie. Certainly, this whole concept that I've laid out, when we start to really question the nature of things, and we question these biases, and we say, okay, well, of course, humans are going to conceive of God as, a man, and probably an older man, because really they're conceiving of a father archetype. And the reason we conceive of a father archetype is because in the human species, men tend to be physically taller than women, and they perform certain social roles in certain cultures. And right, so we can explain how and why we'd anthropomorphize God in this way, or, when we conceive of, well, God wants this, God wants that. Well, what does God want? How do we know what God's will is? How are we receptive to God? All the moral and cultural framing comes from a certain context, right? It's not necessarily universal or applicable at all places at all times. I mean, when we look at religion, religion is evolutionary. Religion is not static. The moment that a religion becomes static is the moment that it dies. The moment that a religion is unable to adapt to new situations is the moment that that religion passes out of relevance. And so the only religions that are relevant are those religions which can constantly update themselves to the present challenges of the times. If those challenges were mostly about, how do we feed the population? We don't have enough food. Everyone's starving. Religion is going to look very different from, okay, everyone's obese. How do we prevent mass obesity? Two very, very different problems with very, very different solutions. And so, religion is going to have to adapt to that. So we can kind of zoom out of everything and say, like, there's no specific, specificity to God, right? There's no connection between God and what I should do right here and right. God doesn't want me to do anything in particular, because God is just this sort of abstraction, this notion of a universal, that it's so divorced from the specificity and particularity of my individual life and my individual problems, whatever they may be. And everyone's problems are different, although a lot of people have commonalities in their problems. Everyone's dealing with a slightly different situation. We talked before about the dice, the rolling of the dice, and the infinite entropy you can get out of that. So ultimately, our problems may have political origins. They may have sociological origins. There might be common origins to our problems, so the way that they manifest is manifold and complex. And what does God care about any of that? Does God even care about individual human beings? I mean, isn't God more concerned with galaxies and things like that? Well, I mean, we can make that argument, but we can also make the argument that as logic proceeds from God, and logic is everywhere at all times, down to the smallest quantum particle, then God really does care about everything, everywhere. And because God's infinite and eternal, God has infinite time and infinite ability to deal with your particular problems. Again, I guess the specificity of it comes back to the question of planning, right? So the Bible is a plan of how to read your life or how to live your life, read your life. The Quran is another plan of how to live your life. If we're going to differentiate between New Testament and Old Testament, we've got two different plans. If we're going to talk about Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, we've got a different plan. If we're going to talk about we could talk about many different plans. Nietzsche gives a plan of what the good life is, or what the correct life, the aristocratic life, what the highest, most principled life to live is. So we have all these different plans, and so we look at that and we say, oh geez, there's a lot of different plans of how I should live my life, and I have no authority, I have no way to differentiate between these plans and say which of these plans is correct. I guess there's an exigency and an urgency to this question, that if you spend the rest of your life looking at the various fields of infinite plans and saying like, well, I just can't conceive of which of these is better, because if we break it down into a tripartite structure, I can understand, the merchant class is clearly ascendant, and obviously it'd be wonderful to have a bunch of money. I could do all kinds of things with that. But of course, that is a bit unprincipled. Really, the priest class is where it's at. Over longevity, the priest class is going to win out. That's where linguistic structures come from, and technology and all these things. Ultimately, it's not the merchants who create that; it's the priest class. So that's probably going to be the one to go with. But then again, the most fundamental class is the warrior class, and through technological acceleration, we might get back to that. We might be in due time. Maybe there's like a Spenglerian cycle. We'll go back to the warrior class, barbarians and stuff. Maybe all this merchant priest stuff, it's like Nietzsche said, it's all just fluff, and it's just kind of the mutation that happens when you get a civilization that's too successful. Then it invests all this energy in these frivolities and whatever. So you can kind of compare these and analyze religions in this way, and different interpretations, different sects, all the thousands of different sects within Islam, within Christianity, even within Judaism has its different sects, although they're a little more tight-knit there. They have their own sort of rabbinical structure to kind of mediate between the different opinions. But you look at some of these different plans there, and you can kind of spend the rest of your life doing the sociology. And I have engaged in a lot of this, and I've gained this feeling of enjoyment as I understand more, and I make more connections, and I share the things that I'm learning, and I try to explain it as a way of learning through teaching. I find that to be enjoyable, and I say, oh, I like this, I want to do more of this. And there are people who need to perform the teaching role. Like it is very important to be a teacher. Not everyone is going to be an astronaut. Some people actually need to be the professors who teach the astronauts, right? So there is a role in society for teachers, but to be a really good teacher, you have to create a curriculum. You have to it's a skill, right? You need to develop that skill, and to really develop that skill well, and to perfect that skill, you have to create good habits and practice. I mean, it takes intense focus over many, many years to become a good teacher. So even if we accept that there is room for a teaching role, of a role of people who just like, oh, we just talk about the various options. We don't choose one for you. We just give you all the options available. Maybe that can be a valuable role in some sense. You can disagree about the particularity of religion, but maybe in some other case, it's good to have, I don't know what field, maybe in the field of say, programming, you can have, we can use an evolutionary programming method, we can use this programming language, we can use all these different tools in a toolbox, and it's up to the student to choose which one to use in which application. But if we're talking about anything, even if there is a role for a teacher, even if there's a role for a sociologist or someone who's trying to objectively analyze things from that out-of-body, pure ideology, pure planning, I'm going to create the plans and then other people can enact them. I'll be the brainy guy and then other people can take action. Even if there's a role for that, there is still, in the act of teaching, there is action, right? The act of teaching. You have to learn how to communicate. And so communication itself takes intense concentration and focus. You can't just wake up one day. I mean, maybe there are some people who are born great communicators. And I think that maybe there is some inherited ability there, but to really get to your highest potential, to achieve and realize that potential, it is a process of action. No matter how theoretical you think you may be able to be, there is a process of action and praxis there. And so the question of how do you bridge the gap between who you want to be and who you currently are is still there. It's not solved by, well, I'm just going to be an academic, because even academia requires a form of action, even if that's a very abstracted form of action, or it's not as direct as, say, the boxer, the MMA fighter. There is still a form of action there. There is still a gap that needs to be closed. And so the question remains open of how you do it. And there really is specific answers to the question of how you bridge that gap. And there are some answers which are really bad, like, well, I just can't bridge the gap, or that's too hard, I shouldn't bother trying, or this is boring, I think I'm going to go distract myself. And then there are better answers, which are like, okay, well, I think that religion might be a good answer to this, but I don't know which religion, so I'm really going to focus on that, with the idea not necessarily of how to treat this as a hobby, but I'm going to focus on this with the intent of how can I move from, like I said with the funnel, how can I move from idea to action, idea to action? How can I'm going to learn something about religion, and then I'm going to implement it in my life, like immediately. Like, don't just learn a bunch about religion and then sort of be standoffish and like, oh, those silly religious people, this is, what atheists do. They learn about all these religions. They say, oh, that's extremely silly. I'll never do anything like that. And they start to analyze their own life, and they're like, oh man, the way that I did this was sort of religious, crypto, pseudo-religious, now I hate that aspect of myself. Like, oh, I believed in masculinity, and masculinity was my god, and so therefore I'm going to deconstruct my masculinity. And this is basically how atheism leads into left-wing theology, essentially, of constantly deconstructing what they refer to as like archons or false gods or hierarchies or whatever. They start seeing God everywhere, and then they start deconstructing any kind of ideal and saying, oh, we should just accept how fat we are and everything else, and wallow in that and be happy with what we have, which, in some sense, I guess, is a kind of pseudo-Buddhism, right? The Buddhists aren't actually obese. The Buddha wasn't actually obese, but, these people sort of imagine that's what that doctrine would look like. But in any case, right, so you can't just stand back and absorb all this information and not do anything with it, because if you do, you're going to get your funnel clogged up, and then it's going to be really hard because you're going to have to ungunk that, and that's, I don't even know how to do that, to be honest with you. So you kind of have to treat today or tomorrow, if it's late at night and you're listening to this before going to bed, then you're going to have to say, okay, well, I really have gunked up my funnel, so I'm going to have to basically put that aside for now and look at a new funnel, a thought-action chain, and I'm just going to put in a little drop. I'm going to learn one thing today, and I'm going to implement it today. And this can be like a 5-minute process. It can be a 15-minute process. It can be, I'm going to do a physical exercise. It can be, I'm going to do a mental exercise. I'm going to read a page in a book, and I'm going to make a note, or I'm going to write a 1-sentence summary of what I learned from that page. Something, anything, right? And as you go along, it can become more actionable and more intensive and more useful and more productive of, okay, I learned how to code something, or, I learned a certain technique, or I learned a new word, or I learned a new concept today. I learned about a new field of thought or discipline or whatever. Like, I achieved an award today after training for a long time. My plan finally came to fruition, right? So you can kind of build up by completing these little tasks of have a thought, implement the thought, learn something, implement it, doing that in a very small kind of instantaneous, you're almost getting instant gratification at that point of I think something, I do something. I learn something, I do something. And you can establish that once again. Then you can kind of free up the funnel in that way. You're kind of pushing things through little by little. You're training your mind to learn that thoughts need to be associated with actions. They can't simply exist on their own, or else they become a toxic spider web that prevents you from ever doing anything. And so you've got to reestablish the connection between the mind and the body. And the way you do that is by starting very small and often with rituals. Again, religion is great here. So you're going through these rituals, and then you're training your mind. You're retraining your mind to act in a completely different way. No longer the way of being intellectually frustrated, where you have all these ideas and you can't do anything with them. But now you are actually training yourself to be someone who thinks and does and thinks and does. And then once you've started to train that, then you can start making big plans in order to achieve big results, right? Whereas before, all you had was big plans and they never came to anything. Now you can start working your way up maybe to the medium-sized plans and then work on those, and then you can get to the bigger plans eventually. But obviously, the younger you start with this, the better. And the older you start with it, the harder it is. I won't say anything is impossible, because as long as you're still alive, then there is, something that you can do, even if that's just kind of, I don't know, something very simple like trying to accept your situation. Would you rather die fearful that you're going to die, or would you rather die peacefully? Would you rather die in a state of panic of like, oh my God, I'm going to die, and I'm so afraid and anxious and upset and bitter and angry and sort of lashing out at people, like you have all this negativity, and then you're kind of angry at people around you? Or would you rather sort of accept it or embrace it? Or, so I think even in kind of the worst situations, there's always kind of action that you can take. Even in that case, if you're really, in a hospital bed somewhere, then, you're not really going to be taking a lot of physical action, but you can, again, do kind of these mentalistic actions, these intentionality. You have an intention, you process that intention, and there's some kind of product, even if it's just a mantra, even if it is just a thought in your head. There is maybe a way to think of thoughts as actions. I think that's where prayer comes in, and meditation, in a sense. You're directing your thoughts. You're not focusing. You're on certain things. You're not allowing them to control. You're not allowing this toxic spider web of ideas to control your emotional state. You're not allowing ideas to make you anxious. You're not allowing ideas to make you fearful. You're not allowing ideas to make you depressed. You're not allowing them to have that emotional effect on you. Maybe right now you feel like meditation is impossible. Maybe right now you feel like even if meditation has worked for you before, you say, well, it can't work right now. Surely I'm just way too emotional for that to work. Clearly, I don't have control over my emotions at this moment. And you define yourself as that way. You define your present state as, well, before I could do it, but now it's just impossible. And that's how you define it. But, you can strive toward a different definition. And even if you don't fully realize that change in yourself, you're moving the needle and you're changing your velocity. That's what's important, not how far you can take it, but what's your directionality. If your directionality is stagnation, then you're dead. But if your directionality is incremental change, even if it's very small, then you have a chance, right? And a chance is better than no chance. 1% is better than 0%. So there's pretty much always something that you can do. And again, you have to base it on velocity. You can't say, well, I'm lower than all these other people, and therefore there's no point to improving. Well, you can say that, but if you have someone who's doing very well and they're not changing at all, and then you're at the bottom and you're changing just a little, eventually, you will catch up. What is it, the tortoise and the hare? The hare runs 99% of the race and then stops to take a nap, and then the tortoise just keeps on going. Eventually, the tortoise wins. So I don't know, is that enough for today? Is that enough about the mind and the body and the plans? And I just kind of repeated, did a lot of repetition of what Matt was saying, um, just in my own words. So thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.